So how do we build those pathways in our brain? We build those pathways the same way they develop in nature. So if you're going to go on a walk through the woods, the best way to do it is find a pathway that's been built there. How does this pathway develop? It's rhythmic, repetitive activation of that piece of ground until it becomes a pathway. If there's no rhythmic activation of that, if I walk a different place every time, it's this pathway going to develop.
So we have to kind of get organized. So one of the ways that I often think about these pathways, you know, Tim and I both lived much of our life in Texas where there are cows, right? And what cattle do, and this same thing happens in nature other ways. We have deer trails, right? You'll find these little trails if you like to hike, right? So you can think about this a couple different ways if you just think about even cattle, okay? In order for a pathway like this to form that cows have all walked on, they had to get organized. All the cows have to come together in an organized way, and they have to do the same thing over and over and over. There's a predictability to what they do every time they want to get to water, basically, right? And these pathways are formed. So you can have this occur, or you can have this. If the cows don't get organized and they're just all over the place and things are chaotic, they're still hitting that patch of grass. We still have, if you think of this as sort of sensory input, right? We still have all of this input coming into the brain. It's just that if it doesn't come in a predictable, organized way, then we don't start to get pathways in the brain. So when I'm talking about when we say the word organization in the brain, what we're really talking about is how many pathways do we have? An organized brain has lots of pathways, lots of little roads throughout the brain. We sometimes will talk about this with parents or something like that, and when you know, they'll show up for a therapy session and describe some awful event that happened during the week where their child, you know, had a humongous meltdown and, you know, was aggressive or smeared poop all over the wall or, you know, something really big, right? And like, what was going on, right? And the deal is, well, that's right. You have a disorganized brain. I'm like, there's cows everywhere up in here, right? If we're all disorganized in here, our behavior is going to look disorganized. So then, this is something I kind of learned from Tim. We were talking about this one day. There's lots I learned from Tim. This is one of the few, lots I learned. But we were talking one day about then cattle, right? So if cattle have this, and I don't understand cows a lot. I've been around them, but it doesn't mean I understand them in any way, really. But if they've been walking to water, and there's this little pathway that they've been following every single time. I grew up as a kid, I spent a lot of time on a ranch, hiking all over it, and if I wanted to find the easiest way to get somewhere, I'd land on one of those cattle trails. We talked about that all the time, right? What happens if somebody builds a fence over the path they're used to taking? What happens if the pathway in my brain no longer works? I have a pathway that says, this is kind of how the world works, this is where I go to survive, right? To go to get water. What happens if it quits working? Somebody builds a fence over my pathway.
With cattle, if you go on a ranch and build a fence across the path that they take to water, what's going to happen to those cows?
They're going to scatter.
They're going to follow that pathway.
Nice try. They don't scatter.
They don't. They're going to follow that pathway up to that fence, and they're going to stand there and die of thirst. And I've worked on I've run some really, really big cattle ranches where we did that, where we cross-fenced our pastures. And every time I do that, I know that for the next 3 days, I'm going to go out there horseback and find those cattle that have come up to that fence and stopped and drive them the new place to water. And I usually have to do that at least 3 days before they can find water. The old pathway doesn't go away. I have to help them start building a new pathway to water. And the brain is like that. If I've got a pathway up to my neocortex from my brainstem, and for whatever reason there's a block in that pathway, then when I get sensory input, it's going to run up to where that block is, and it will stop there, and all the neurons and connections above that block are going to start to die off. Unless I can build a new pathway to that area of my brain. Because neurons that don't find connection get reabsorbed by your system. We've got billions and billions of neurons, and we can create new neurons through new sensory experience.